Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and today we're going to be covering Lecture 1B, the second part in the Introduction to Behavior Analysis. This particular lecture is going to deal with primarily with the history of behavior analysis, and here I have some of the forefathers of behavior analysis: Charles Darwin, Ivan Pavlov, E.L. Thorndike, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. So let's talk a little bit about these gentlemen. There's some argument over whether Darwin's really one of the founders of applied behavior analysis. I like to go back to Charles Darwin because his theories of natural selection and the effect of selection pressure on species change and evolution really sets the stage for the work that B.F. Skinner does later in the 1930s. And so I like to put him in there because the underlying the theoretical underpinnings of selection can be traced back to Darwin from B.F. Skinner's work on selection by consequences. So when we get farther down the road, we may talk a little bit more about this, but I like to put him in the list. The first name that you probably recognize as being part of psychology is Ivan Pavlov and his respondent or classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist. He wasn't a psychologist at all, but his work had a profound impact on psychology, and particularly on the development of behavioral psychology. Around the same time, E.L. Thorndike was looking at animal behavior and developed his law of effect. And so historically, these three figures are very important. And in particular, Ivan Pavlov had a direct impact on John Watson, who established the beginnings of radical behaviorism and what's sometimes referred to as reflexive psychology or SR psychology. He really believed that you could use Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning to explain all behavior, and based most of his career on that, most of his experimentation and his research. However, he also wrote a very, very important paper called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. And in it, he makes a very strong case for psychology to leave the world of philosophy and Freudian psychoanalysis and introspection and move into the more solid disciplines like biology and chemistry and physics. In 1913, in this article, he wrote, quote, "Psychology as the behaviorist views it is a purely objective, experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent upon the readiness with which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness." Now, it's important to note here that he is formally rejecting introspection, which was the major approach established by Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, and he's rejecting the Freudian approach to psychology that talks about consciousness. And so he's completely moving away from traditional views of psychology and emphasizing the need to move in the direction of natural science. He said, what we need to do is to start work upon psychology, making behavior, not consciousness, the objective point of our attack. So very, very aggressive pushing of psychology as the natural science of behavior rather than this non-scientific Freudian psychoanalytic psychology that bases much on the the differences between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. So this was a big turning point for American psychology, and it really lent itself to major changes across the United States toward moving psychology in the direction of hard science. The next founder that I want to talk a little bit about is B.F. Skinner. He published his dissertation, The Behavior of Organisms, in 1938, which really talked a lot about the nature of operant conditioning, and began a new kind of radical behaviorism, a new kind of approach to the study of behavior, one that was not based in Ivan Pavlov's work, but rather harkened back to the work of Charles Darwin and E.L. Thorndike. In terms of Skinner's radical behaviorism, he acknowledged the existence of private events upon which cognitive psychology's sort of mentalistic constructs were based. So here was cognitive psychology trying to talk about the private events of thinking and reasoning. And he did not disagree that those things exist. He did, however, talk about them as being forms of behavior, not causes of behavior. His radical behaviorism did not restrict the science of behavior to those behaviors that could be detected by more than one person. So they did not have to be solely observable by an outside observer. And he considered private covert behavior as being no different than public behavior, that covert and overt behavior were positively correlated, that what we think and what we do are often very similar, and that the cause of both the things that we're thinking and feeling and the reasoning that we do and our overt behavior is actually external and environmental. In other words, something out in the world makes us think and reason and feel in ways that that are correlated with our public behavior. So here's a quote from Skinner in 1974. "What is felt or introspectively observed is not some non-physical world of consciousness, mind, or mental life, but merely the observation of one's own body." In other words, Skinner saw thinking and reasoning as the brain observing itself. It's kind of an interesting perspective. We fast forward to 1968, and we meet the introduction of applied behavior analysis as a formal discipline. In a paper by Baer, Wolf, and Risley, Don Baer makes the argument that there are 7 characteristics of applied behavior analysis. He said, quote, "Obviously the study of ABA must be applied, it must be behavioral, and it must be analytic. In addition, it should be technological, conceptually systematic, and effective, and it should display some generality." So he has big dreams for what behavior analysis is supposed to be in 1968, and if we look at each of these items highlighted in red, we can see exactly what he means. So when he says that applied behavior analysis needs to be applied, he really means that the interventions need to be determined by the social significance of the behavior being investigated or manipulated. So it needs to have social importance. It needs to be meaningful for the individual. Typically, it involves everyday functional behaviors or maladaptive behaviors that are interfering with normal functioning. And in that sense, it sets it apart from the basic research in the laboratory using white rats and pigeons to an applied, more realistic, everyday application, I guess I would say. Okay, so it also needs to be behavioral. There needs to be real behavior that needs improvement. So direct observation is required. We have to look at the behavior and determine whether or not there really is a problem, rather than taking secondhand reporting from other people. It's not good enough for a teacher to tell us that the child is a problem child, or that a caregiver says that the child has aggressive tendencies. Those are secondhand reports, and as a discipline, applied behavior analysis, requires that the behavior that we're going to change be observable and measurable and confirmable. And so we have to be able to go in and do direct observation and observe and measure and confirm the behavioral problem before we can develop a method of intervention. And as we've moved from the 1960s to where we are today, new technologies are making the observation of behaviors easier and easier and easier. And it needs to be analytic. It's applied behavioral analysis, so it has to be analytic. It needs to rely on a continual functional analysis of the relationship between the behavior and its consequences, or behavior in the environment. It implies that an analytical approach is required rather than just using intuition. And so we have to collect data, and we have to do graphing, and we have to analyze the data, as opposed to simply using our intuition to say whether or not we think our treatment is working. So it needs to be more scientific. It doesn't rely simply on educated guesses or evidence from other investigation or from other people. We actually have to see it work on the individuals that we're working with. Now, he also said it should be technological, and what he really means by this is that we be very clear in our language, that we use technical language, that we define our target behaviors, our procedures, and our measurements in ways that are really understandable, that they should be operational based on how we went about measuring them or how we went about creating the procedure and what the procedure actually is. All aspects of the study, the independent variable, the dependent variable, the procedures, everything have to be completely identified and precisely defined. And that's really what he means by technological. He stated that applied behavior analysis has to be conceptually systematic, meaning that all interventions should be described in terms of the general principles of behavior that were used to derive this method. So it is behavior analysis in its applied form, and so it should rely on the basic research of behavior analysis to develop the interventions. So there needs to be a connection between the basic research, the philosophy, and the applications. All of the interventions have to be based on empirically determined principles of behavior. And there has to be a degree of logic, a degree of empirically based logic to back up any intervention. Finally, he said that there should be some generality. And that means that behavior change is effective if it lasts over time. So it has to generalize over time. If it appears in environments other than the one where the interventions were applied. So we want to know that if we did the treatment in school, does it generalize to the home or to other situations? And that it spreads to other behaviors that were not directly treated. And that it should produce effects that are not the automatic result of treatment. So he really wants to see treatment have a domino effect across time, across environments, across behaviors, and even in some cases across individuals would be very important. So you can see this historical development of behavior analysis in terms of how we got to the field of applied behavior analysis really occurring starting in about 1968. So I want to finish with some historical events that were important, just to note them. So we can trace the history of applied behavior analysis back directly to a paper that was written by a researcher named Fuller in 1959, entitled The Operant Conditioning of a Vegetative Patient, where he used operant conditioning methods to change the behavior of someone considered to be brain dead, basically, in a coma, in a vegetative state. 9 years later, the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior was started. The APA had been in charge of most of the journals in psychology in America, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to publish articles that were based on single subject design single case studies, and relying much more on statistical methods. And so behavior analysts found it harder and harder to get their work published, so they decided to establish their own journal. And that was in 1958. In 1959, Ione and Michael published The Psychiatric Nurse and Behavioral Engineer, where they showed that you could use behavioral practices, behavioral interventions, with people who were not formally trained in behavior analysis. That a psychiatric nurse could be trained to modify or engineer behaviors of her patients. And really, applied behavior analysis looks to this particular article as the formal beginning of applied behavior analysis. In 1963, so the first journal is in 1958, and over the next 2 decades, over the next 20 years, a series of journals begin to be published. The first in 1963, Behavior Research and Therapy, and in 1966, the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy is established. In 1968, we get the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. In 1970, 2 journals start, Behavior Therapy and the Journal of Behavior Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry. In 1977, Behavior Modification, and in 1978, the Behavior Analyst, which is more of a philosophical journal, were started. And in 1978, the same year, the Association for Behavior Analysis was established. So you can see that there's really, from 1958 to 1978, there's a strong pattern of new journals being established and articles publishing and research moving forward, and the establishment of professional associations and professional organizations for these behavior analysts. From 1980 until today, there has been a steady continuation of basic and applied research in behavior analysis. And starting around the late 90s to the year 2000, we began to see an emphasis on functional behavioral approaches. So not looking simply at behavior as just a behavior, but that behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that it serves a function, it serves a purpose. And that really created a new direction for applied behavior analysis, because we began to look at the need to understand the function or the purpose of behavior, even misbehavior, before we developed treatments to change it. And so that was a very important step. And at the same time, we see the establishment of the BACB, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, a national organization that licenses behavior therapists, and specifically licensing or certification for board-certified behavior analysts, which is now a huge trend and is now state by state requirements for residential care facilities, for school districts, for treatment facilities are beginning to, state by state, they're beginning to employ requirements that you have board-certified behavior analysts on staff. And so the growth of the field of board-certified behavior analysts has been growing at a hugely rapid pace. So that's just kind of a little bit of background and history, a little bit more history than you get in your book. And so we still have 2 more lectures, 1C and 1D, and then we'll be done with Chapter 1, and Chapters 2 and 3 will follow that for this unit. Okay, have a good day.